On the 9th of March 2022, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan welcomed his Israeli counterpart to Ankara. The first such visit since 2008, it marked a symbolically important moment in a relationship that's been heavily strained in recent years. But what made the meeting especially remarkable was that just a couple of decades ago, the two countries had had an incredibly close, if not unique, strategic partnership. So what caused the breakdown in relations? What led to this latest meeting? And will we see a new partnership emerge? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. We tend to think of close strategic partnerships and even formal alliances as essentially being enduring. Barring major ideological shifts, such as a revolution, countries will tend to maintain close economic, political and strategic ties. Certainly, they may have severe disagreements, such as between the United States and France over the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Sometimes they may even find themselves fundamentally at odds over an issue, as happened between the United States and Britain over Suez in 1956. However, the assumption is that they'll remain broadly aligned. But sometimes extremely close partnerships can break down completely. One of the most interesting examples in modern international relations is the collapse of the relationship between Israel and Turkey. At the end of the 1990s, these two countries had built an extremely close strategic partnership. And yet, a decade later, that relationship had collapsed. Turkey and Israel lie around 200 kilometres from each other at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. At 780,000 square kilometres or 300,000 square miles, Turkey is the 36th largest member of the 193-member United Nations. Meanwhile, Israel, at around 21,000 square kilometres or 8,000 square miles, is the 149th largest member. Turkey's population currently stands at around 84.5 million. While almost 99% are Muslim, there are Christian communities as well as a very small Jewish community. In contrast, Israel's population currently stands at around 9.4 million. Around three-quarters are Jewish and approximately 18% are Muslim. Economically, Israel is a high-income country with a per capita GDP of around $39,500 a year. Turkey is classed as upper middle income with a GDP per capita of around $27,000. Although the Republic of Turkey emerged from the Ottoman Empire in 1923 and Israel wasn't created until 1948, the two peoples have a long history stretching back centuries. As well as having provided a haven for Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, at its height, the Ottoman Empire had included large parts of the modern Middle East. This included present-day Israel and Palestine, which came under British rule at the end of the First World War. However, our story really starts in the aftermath of the Second World War and the foundation of Israel in 1948. Although Turkey opposed the partition of Palestine and abstained on Israel's membership of the United Nations, on the 28th of March 1949, it became the very first Muslim state to recognise Israel, establishing diplomatic relations with it soon afterwards. In many ways, this made sense. Quite apart from their respective difficult relations with the Arab world, both countries saw themselves as part of the broader West that was emerging with the start of the Cold War. Moreover, their founding state ideologies, Kemalism in Turkey and Zionism in Israel, shared interesting similarities, being built around secular statist nationalism. In the decades that followed, the two countries established a complex relationship. While efforts were made to build ties behind the scenes, Turkey was cautious about publicly pursuing closer cooperation, especially when this could be seen to antagonise its Arab neighbours or, increasingly, Turkish public opinion. For example, diplomatic relations were downgraded following the Suez conflict in 1956 and after Israel annexed East Jerusalem in 1980. However, the situation would begin to change in the late 1980s and early 1990s as the two countries began to discuss their regional security concerns. At the same time, international efforts to try to break the Israeli-Palestinian stalemate created a better political environment for cooperation. This all came to fruition in 1991 when they re-established full diplomatic relations. Then, in 1996, they signed a free trade agreement. This not only led to a huge surge in business links, it also saw Turkey become a popular tourist destination. Indeed, at one stage, as many as 500,000 Israelis visited each year. But perhaps most significantly, the two countries also developed a close strategic partnership. Alongside their trade deal, they signed 2 military training and cooperation agreements. As well as paving the way for joint military exercises, their defence industries also began to work together closely. While the late 1990s marked what is now widely regarded as the golden age of Turkish-Israeli relations, the cooperation nevertheless continued into the new millennium. However, things slowly began to change after the religiously oriented Justice and Development Party, AKP, led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, took power in November 2002. Despite pledging to remain close to the West, Erdogan started to build ties to the Middle East and began to speak out more openly about the Palestinian issue. That said, at first, he seemed to see his role more as a peacemaker. For example, in May 2005, during a visit to Israel, he presented himself as a bridge between Israel and the Arab world. The first major tensions really emerged in 2008. Following clashes in the Gaza Strip, Erdogan heavily criticised Israel. This in turn led to a high-profile confrontation between Erdogan and the Israeli president Shimon Peres at the 2009 World Economic Forum in Davos. However, the real breaking point came in May 2010 when 6 Turkish ships set out to deliver aid to the Gaza Strip, which was under an Israeli military blockade. Despite still being in international waters approximately 130 kilometres off the Israeli coast, Israeli commandos nevertheless raided the largest of the ships, the Mavi Marmara. Claiming that they were attacked first, the Israeli troops opened fire, killing 9 and injuring almost 30. The incident caused an uproar in Turkey. Recalling the country's ambassador to Tel Aviv, Erdogan accused Israel of having blood on its hands and made it clear that the special relationship was over. He also called for a UN investigation, which later found that Israel had broken international law by raiding the vessel and that its actions had been disproportionate. In the period that followed, Turkey became increasingly outspoken about Israel. This was also shaped by the start of the Arab Spring, the widespread uprising against the region's autocratic leaders just a few months later. As Erdogan came to see himself as the leader of the movement, his populist anti-Israeli rhetoric increased. Meanwhile, Israel, having lost its closest regional partner, also moved in a different direction. Against the backdrop of growing energy exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean, Tel Aviv steadily developed closer ties to Turkey's long-standing regional adversaries, Greece and Cyprus. Despite this, Washington was keen to see relations improve between the two countries. In 2013, President Obama brokered a telephone conversation between Erdogan and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In return for an apology from Israel, Turkey agreed to restore diplomatic relations. This came to fruition 3 years later in June 2016 when Israel agreed also to pay compensation to the families of those killed. However, any hopes of lasting progress were short-lived. Less than 2 years later, in May 2018, Turkey expelled the Israeli ambassador and pulled its own ambassador from Tel Aviv after heavy clashes in Gaza left 68 Palestinians dead. Relations continued to remain strained after this. That was until, in January 2022, the foreign ministers of the two countries held their first direct telephone conversation in 13 years. From there, things moved quickly. Just weeks later, and following high-level diplomatic discussions, Turkey announced the visit by Israel's president. So, what led to the breakthrough? In truth, there are many factors that seem to have contributed. For example, it may well have been shaped by the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in November 2020. Israel provided vital military support to Azerbaijan, which shares close ties to neighbouring Turkey. Then there's Ankara's apparent wish to rebuild relations with the West in general and the United States in particular, as it goes through an extremely serious economic crisis. These ties have been strained in recent years by Erdogan's apparent friendship with Russia's President Vladimir Putin and by Turkey's decision to purchase a Russian anti-aircraft system. Ankara may well believe that restoring ties to Israel may help its relations with Washington. Finally, there are regional factors that may have played a part. Turkey will no doubt have been watching with concern as growing numbers of Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco and Sudan, have established relations with Israel. Moreover, strident support for the Palestinian cause doesn't resonate in the same way as it once did. It was against this backdrop that Erdogan welcomed President Herzog to Ankara. and by all accounts, the meeting seemed to have gone well. Certainly at the press conference that followed their discussions, there was little evidence of previous strains. Erdogan spoke about his hope that the two countries would continue to build on their trade links and would explore energy cooperation. Overall, the visit was judged to be an important success by both countries. Of course, the key question is how likely it is to produce longer-term results. In truth, it's hard to say. The sincerity may be there. The problem is that Erdogan in particular is notoriously unpredictable. Turkish foreign policy tends to rest on his personal whims. Today he may be keen to rebuild ties. Tomorrow, who knows? That said, both countries have reasons to see results. Aside from the general benefits of a renewed relationship, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed the political and diplomatic environment. Ankara and Tel Aviv are both trying to balance long-standing ties to the West with close relationships to Moscow. In this sense, they innately understand one another's difficulties. More to the point, the squeeze on Russian energy presents them both with a valuable opportunity. Israel has significant natural gas reserves. A close relationship with Turkey would provide an opportunity to develop a new route for this to reach European markets. And Turkey would benefit as a key transit state for new energy sources. In this sense, the current rapprochement is an important step at just the right moment. Countries with close strategic relationships can and do fall out with one another occasionally. However, there are few more interesting or more significant breaks than the collapse of the relationship between Israel and Turkey. Having become the first Muslim-majority state to recognise Israel in 1949, Turkey formed a close strategic relationship with the country in late 1990s. But this collapsed a little over a decade later as Turkey moved closer to the Arab world and Israel launched an attack against a Turkish ship carrying supplies to the Gaza Strip. And while steps were taken to rebuild this relationship, the ties nevertheless remained frosty until now. But will this latest meeting between the presidents bear fruit? Certainly, both countries have a lot to gain, politically, economically, and strategically. Ultimately, though, the question is whether the wider factors that have undermined their relations in the past can also be held in check. Not least of all, Israel's often overly heavy-handed responses to security issues and Erdogan's notoriously erratic behaviour. I hope you found that interesting. If so, here are some more videos that you might find useful. Thanks so much for watching and see you in the next video.